Welcome to Ignite Insights, our exclusive segment here on Ignite Television, where we bring you engaging conversations with key figures helping us understand issues shaping society today. I'm Ramona Luthi, and today I'm joined by economist Richard Rambarran to explore how Guyanese businesses and workers can adapt and thrive in an increasingly interconnected market. From the rise of new enterprises to changes in the labor force, Richard will share his perspective on the evolving economic landscape and offer insights on how we can remain competitive in a dynamic environment. Welcome, Richard. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you, of course, Ramona, for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So let's just jump right into it.
Sure.
How would you describe the current influence of new businesses and workers entering Guyana on the local economy?
That's, of course, a very loaded question. And I think we have to frame it firstly within the context of what is happening in Guyana. When one views the economic growth figures that exist, of course, we've been in double-digit growth for quite some time. And so one can rightly imagine that this contemporary Guyana, 2025, is not the same Guyana that one would have seen 10 years ago, or perhaps even 5 years ago. Each year when we see these double-digit growth numbers, it means that things are transforming at an exponential rate. That is what the translation of that means in terms of the economic reality or the lived reality for both Guyanese consumers as well as Guyanese businessmen. And so back to the specificity of the question, when one examines in detail new enterprises, new entrants to the labor market, etc., they really are doing two things. One, supplying an economy that is on a rapid growth trajectory, where perhaps the local base would not have been able to have expanded as rapidly to support. And then secondly, in areas where the labor market, both from a skilled as well as an unskilled level, may not have been able to match volume as well as skill set of what is happening. If you think, before I close my prefatory remark on that, but if you think about something transforming any entity, whether it be a company, whether it be a local economy, whether it be a country, a regional economy, any entity that is more than doubling its output, more than quadrupling its output within a short period of time, must draw not on local resources only, but also from resources that it would capture from outside. Perhaps not capture, but be able to utilize from external influences. And so that, I think, represents in a very strong manner what we see happening here in Guyana, the filling of gaps and the support for a rapidly growing and expanding economy.
So you touched on some of the difficulties that businesses in general may be facing because of the growth of the economy or how fast the economy is growing.
Yes.
So what specifically would you say some of the challenges that smaller businesses or traditional businesses would face with the competing market?
Absolutely. So smaller businesses and small businesses, startup enterprises, generally always have the toughest time in an economy. Whether it is an economy that is growing slowly, whether it is an economy that has been inflicted by an exogenous shock, such as COVID-19, such as collapse of world market prices, or whether it's an economy that is growing exponentially, such as Guyana's. There is no fashion in which we can frame an economic story where small businesses are not exposed to prevailing economic circumstances. And so, having been in leadership of the private sector, having been around business support organizations, and myself being involved in business advisory, I can say to you definitively that small businesses are thriving, firstly. There are opportunities that are existing within the economic landscape as well as redounding to businesses that they would not have otherwise had. But there are also growing pains, if you will, for some of these small businesses. And competitiveness is an important element of it. And the ability to adapt, the ability to adopt, adapting technology, adopting practices, the ability to remain competitive within an architecture and a landscape that perhaps does not always keep up in terms of the pace of change with what we're seeing in the economic reality or the commercial reality on a daily basis. They are, of course, exposed to a number of elements. So opportunities are there. Small businesses are thriving, but there are obviously challenges too that exist for small businesses.
And how would you say factors like pricing, supply chains, customer preferencing, how would you say those things affect the competitiveness?
Or in an incredible way. It is no small secret what has been happening in the world. I think the past 5 years within the global story of commerce has been really impactful, not just on small businesses, but also generally the business community. If one looks at COVID-19, if one looks at the Russia-Ukraine war, if one looks at supply chain disruptions as a result of the Suez Canal, if one looks at the massive increases in rates of shipping from some of our major suppliers, China, Panama, etc., you can readily observe that there obviously would be challenges. I have spoken at length on a number of other programs when I've been asked to articulate Guyana's economic outlay and the prevailing reality, that the policy responsiveness by the government of Guyana to some of those challenges ought to be lauded, because the pass-through effects to consumers, the pass-on effects or the knock-on effects to businesses have been cushioned by the policy measures, particularly, and I've drawn allusion to this a number of times in an explicit manner, I've also expounded on it in various interviews, particularly the measure to revert freight charges to pre-pandemic levels, particularly the petrol prices, the prices of the pump, and their pass-through effects to consumers, and then particularly the lowering and elimination of value-added tax on a number of items, and also their move from zero-rated to exempt, and then ensuring that what needs to be in zero-rated is in zero-rated. So it's a very dynamic time. The impact on small businesses would obviously be more sharp and pronounced than an enterprise that is large and is able to be resilient. But supply chain, consumer preferences, the global economy, and the impacts of the exogenous shocks are all interlinked and essentially operate in a synergistic fashion. And of course, medium to long effects from those exogenous shocks can change supply and then concomitantly change consumer preferences over time. So that would be a little bit of my thoughts on that.
So moving on, in what ways has the growth of the workforce from outside of Guyana influenced job opportunities here, would you say?
Yeah, so I think the public knows that I would have worked closely with the International Organization for Migration, IOM, on the production of a report which analyzes the labor market in Guyana. And we have obviously modeled the labor market and examined that even if one takes all of the workers in Guyana who are unemployed, underemployed, or in part-time work, and we place them completely into the labor force, based on the rate of growth of the economy, we will still need to fill the labor market gap. That is to say, the gap between supply and demand. Now, we could not have, as a country, been able to realize our full rates of economic growth. We would not have been able to realize our full potential without support from migrant workers or expatriate workers, or migrant workers and expatriate workers, the two, of course, being distinct. We would not have been able to. And the reason why is that the economy is expanding so rapidly. There are so many new areas of services. There are a number of services that need to be provided in Guyana where the skill sets have not traditionally existed. And so, in the first instance, filling that gap is very important. Otherwise, we will be, for the want of a better expression, leaving money on the table. We will not be able to fully realize our growth potential. So that is one element of it. Secondly, and I alluded to it when I was discussing the first, secondly is the fact that there is some skills mismatch that exists, and there is a need for us to ensure that our labor force is upskilled, retrained, the skill sets and the academic programs, the TVET programs, etc., are reaching the populace, firstly, at a cost that it becomes accessible, which in Guyana's instance, it's free, and also in the areas that would buttress economic growth. That is to say, let me give a practical example. I should not be having a skill set being promoted, being readily accessible, when it does not map into the economic architecture that exists. The demand that exists. So if one looks at what the GOAL program has been able to do, if one looks at the elimination of the University of Guyana's fees, if one looks at the opening of new TVET centers in collaboration with ExxonMobil, for example, if one looks at the increased emphasis that is being placed on the TVET institutions, we would understand that an agglomeration of all of those activities will ensure that whilst this skill set that we do not have today is being filled by individuals who have the skill set, that is to say migrant workers, expatriates, we are readying our labor force actively for taking over those roles. The fact that the local content exists means that we are in the mode of transferring knowledge from those individuals to our domestic labor force. And so those two instances that I mentioned here, firstly, to fill the gap, and then secondly, to ensure skills alignment, is really where our labor force is at the moment. And in a contemporary Guyana, I think what we will see is rates of what is called in the corporate world nationalization, especially by multinational companies. That is to say, we will see a number of Guyanese taking leadership positions in these multinational companies that are present in Guyana. And we will ensure, we will see over time that more and more Guyanese continue to play a part in the areas that perhaps historically they have not played a role.
So it's important to gather that skills development and vocational training are especially essential to our local market, but it's more about our people grasping that opportunity.
Yes, absolutely.
To make, as you said, fill the gap. So are there any areas of training and education that you think need improvement?
I think what we really need to have is a transformation in our culture. The modus vivendi, the way of living for quite some time, has been, you're growing up, you have to follow one of the professions. And All Guyanese would know. You grew up in a
Stereotypes.
Guyanese household, you have your stereotypes, doctors, lawyers, accountants, and that's how come we're filled with so many of them. Guyanese people are very dynamic, innovative, and successful. What I'd want to see, I think, and what will really help is a transformation of that way of thinking and mode of life. To understand that all professions have value, to understand that all professions are necessary, and we all play a role in the growth story of Guyana, and we are all important in the way that we contribute to the country. I think once we have that mindset, we are going to be in a much better position as a country, simply because we won't be guiding our children, guiding the young persons in the labor market to professions which we have traditionally deemed as being esteemed professions. One will now understand that if I'm involved in TVET, I am able to make a good living. I am able to earn as much as someone who perhaps has an academic degree. And in some instances, the nature of that industry may be so competitive that my prices are able to be top tier when we look at the global market. I'll just give you a short example, a brief example. If one looks at a plumber in Guyana, have you, Ramona, had to do any plumbing work or anything recently, or you know anybody who has to do plumbing work? It's one of the most difficult tradesmen to get in Guyana. One of the most difficult. Electricians, the same. Contractors, the same. Any individual who is involved in a TVET program at the moment, they fetch such high rates of daily pay, or their rates that they have for their job work. It's really at an international type of level. And so once we begin to transform that understanding of the labor market, I think we will be in a better position to ensure that we do not have concentration of the Guyanese labor market within just a select pool of individuals, of skill sets rather.
I agree. And I can definitely see what you're saying, because even at the office here, when we need a plumber to come in, it's very hard to get on his schedule because he's in demand.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what kinds of policies or regulations could help strengthen local businesses or even entrepreneurs themselves while still encouraging fair competition?
Yeah, so that's an important point. And I think we have to understand the context of a market economy, firstly, and recognize and perhaps have an edification in the public domain on the fact that we are in a free market society. We are in a market society which is at its core driven by competition and competitive behavior. And there obviously will need to be a framework within which businesses and people operate. But by and large, we are existing in a free market society. But it's important for us to understand as well what anti-competitive behavior looks like and what antitrust behavior looks like. And if we examine market distorting practices, that is to say, in instances where we may think competition is existing at face value, but really all of the suppliers are holding one head, for the want of a better phrase, they're holding one head and essentially setting a market price and not competing with each other, but holding what is called in industry cooperative oligopoly, and engaging in anti-competitive behavior, that then becomes dangerous for the society and for the economy, and particularly for the consumers. Forget about the fact that it destroys the entrepreneurial landscape. It impacts on the consumers in the sense that they cannot benefit from competitive interface or interplay between companies, which at its core lowers prices. So it's important for us to be able to recognize when that is being done. If you find that instances of such nature are happening, I think it's important for us to also look at the method of recourse that exists in Guyana. There are voluntary and self-regulated organizations of business people that can support with helping to alleviate that type of behavior by way of chambers of commerce and other business support organizations. And if that form of self-regulation does not work, then there is the constitutional body called the Competition and Consumer Affairs Commission, which can then launch its own formal investigation. And they are set up not only to deal with consumer complaints, but anti-competitive behavior also, which, as I would have mentioned, has real market distorting impacts. So it's important for us to be able to understand that we live in a free market society, but it's governed by rules, practices, and a structure and superstructure that essentially promotes and protects competition. And we, as participants in this market, must be able to identify when anti-competitive behavior is happening and report it to whether it's a self-regulating body or the competent authority by way of the Constitutional Commission.
But in that regard, how do you sometimes gauge between anti-competitiveness and exploitation?
Well,
because
differentiating... Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to further explain, because I understand the anti-competitiveness, but then you have the varying price ranges. And locally, we see this quite often. We have a lot of businesses exploiting customers, like their prices are exorbitant. So how do you gauge that?
So that is a very important point in terms of the recognition. When you have prices that are unreasonable, and it's important for you in that instance to educate yourself as a consumer on what the pertinent price ought to be. If one looks, for example, at the international market and you see that there are disruptions in the international market, you understand that there are supply shocks that are happening, wars that are happening. Remember, we are not a country that produces everything we consume. We are still integrated into the global architecture, and we still are exposed to volatilities that may arise in the global economy. And so one has to observe that and understand changes in market prices as distinct from exploitative behavior. Now, it is not always easily distinguishable, but generally, if you have a number of enterprises, a number of business enterprises that exist in a particular area, in a geographic area, and the prices are similar in nature, but higher than what is expected, you will find that that is anti-competitive behavior. If you have a single business existing in an area and the prices are higher than what you expect, that cannot be deemed as anti-competitive because there is no competition. It cannot be deemed as exploitation because if it was a case of exploitation, you would have had other businesses entering into that geographic area to establish. Remember, it's a free market we're dealing with. So what I'd say is important to look out for are geographic areas where a number of enterprises exist, but yet the price for commodities or the prices for commodities are higher in all of those enterprises that exist in the geographic area than an area which does not have that level or number of enterprises. So at its core, it's important to distinguish that. And being an informed consumer is very important. You know, we oftentimes get caught up, I guess, you know, scrolling some of these social media pages that all day they're involved in some sort of controversy, or we're observing, you know, some Instagram or TikTok trend or something, as opposed to educating oneself on what the daily occurrences or the weekly occurrences are in the local and international markets, which can help you to make much better consumer choices.
Okay, so let's move on a little. How can established businesses innovate or adapt to remain successful in a changing market?
Well, that is a very, very deep question, and it touches on a number of key areas. I think firstly would be looking to the international market, looking externally and seeing what other companies who are similarly circumstanced, companies who are similarly sized, what they have done. When you examine what those companies have done, you look to see what you can adopt into your business and areas in which you can ensure that you adapt it for the local context. That, I think, is one where it's extremely important, and one which from time to time I observe that we may be missing in our local landscape. That is the first. The secondly is to ensure that we invest in our people. Investing in the people that make the company is extremely important. There was an era bygone in Guyana in the private sector where only a few companies invested in training for their workers or for their people, for their human resources. If you look at what has been happening in Guyana in an evolving landscape, that is beginning to change. But more of that is needed, because really we now are at the cutting edge of the global landscape in terms of competitiveness. And when we look at Guyanese businesses ought to ensure that we are not just trying to utilize and capture the opportunities that are here, but we are also building a private sector that can become internationally competitive. When Guyana's economic growth numbers begin to slow and we start to enter into a new long-term sustainable rate of growth, Guyanese enterprises should be in a position to say, look externally. And so because of the transformations that we are seeing here, we must then be in a position to be competitive in other markets and win businesses. And to do that, looking at matured markets and companies that are large and more mature, or in more mature markets, that's important. Investing in your people, that's important. Ensuring, thirdly, that you have strong corporate governance and good practices in your management to elicit the levels of efficiencies that are needed. Those three areas, I think, are ways in which domestic enterprises can ensure that they control the factors that I would have mentioned, and they can ensure that they are as competitive as possible. Obviously, Ramona, there will be various areas of the playing field. For example, commercial banking, access to finance. For example, what's happening in the labor market. For example, what's happening in the energy sector. the rate at which power can be provided, etc., that one cannot control. But within the company, what I like to term the internal dynamics to the organization, we ought to ensure that we are at an international level in the way that we approach and our planning for moving forward.
So, in a bid to adopt to these international standards and maintaining that level playing field or maintaining that level of competitiveness as it relates to international companies, how important would you say it is to maintain our cultural uniqueness as local entities?
Yeah.
And how do you think that will influence or attract more customers?
So it goes hand in hand. Cultural uniqueness for our domestic enterprises. No one knows Guyanese like Guyanese. And we never realize that until we are amongst non-Guyanese. In Guyana, especially given the season that we are in, there tends to be quite a lot of fighting that happens in the society. War of words, emotions and tensions run high, etc. But no one knows Guyanese like Guyanese. And embracing that cultural uniqueness, I think, is a unique selling point for many enterprises. If one takes a look at some of our sister countries within the CARICOM, Jamaica, for example, Trinidad, for example, they have a number of campaigns run by government and the private sector, in instances together, and then sometimes parallel to each other, where they actually promote buying local, supporting the domestic enterprise, supporting things that are uniquely for Jamaica or uniquely produced by Trinidadians. It is a sense of pride that is instilled in the consumer in those particular countries. And I think we need to ensure that as Guyanese, we have that consumer pride too. It's a unique selling point that enterprises can capture. And it is something which I believe the organized private sector, the business support associations, ought to examine promoting. Obviously, the Chamber of Commerce, for example, myself and a few other gentlemen historically have lobbied strongly for local content in Guyana, but local content is circumscribed to the oil and gas sector. Obviously, that cannot be applied to every single sector. That in itself will have us underperforming as an economy if applied to every single sector, and it will just become too cumbersome and burdensome. But promoting the Guyanese-ness is extremely important for ensuring consumer behavior and for ensuring that the Guyanese consuming populace supports what is uniquely their own. So I look forward to seeing that being done.
I do agree that maintaining a level of cultural identity will be advantageous to the Guyanese market as well. So keeping that in mind, what changes do you expect in Guyana's job market and retail sector over the next 5 to 10 years?
In both the retail sector as well as the job market. So firstly, in the retail sector, I expect more competition, both from external competitors involved in our local market, as well as domestic competitors. Because as the market moves towards a greater degree of maturity, moves along its stages of development, you'll find more enterprises emerging. You'll find a stronger consuming population. The consuming population in the country itself will naturally grow. And so the volume of commerce, as well as the rate of growth of the commercial provision, that is something that I anticipate will be perhaps putting us within the Anglophonic Caribbean at the forefront of commercial competitiveness in that regard. So on that front, that is what I see. In the labor market, it's a bit more nuanced because you are not responding. The changes that have to be made cannot be done immediately. We can't tell somebody, go become a petroleum engineer with 5 years of experience tomorrow, in the way that we can say to someone, open a business and start selling cups and you will be responsive to a need. It takes time. And so there's a certain degree of inertia that exists, and there's a certain amount of time that has to allow for the factors to really have their impact in the economy. It's not the right phrase that I'm using for it, but it's not coming to my mind right now. But I expect to see a labor market that is more aligned with the demands for the Guyanese economy. I anticipate a labor market that is more skilled or semi-skilled. So there are more prevailing skill sets that exist. And I anticipate a labor market where there still will be migrant labor supporting in the gap areas that we cannot, as Guyanese, immediately fill. So it is going to continue to be a mix of nationalities in the Guyanese labor market, but I expect to see Guyanese emerging as holders of the real premium earning jobs in the Guyanese labor market, as well as being able to support the TVET demanded skill sets.
All right. So finally, what advice would you give to entrepreneurs and workers who want to stay competitive in this evolving economy?
So entrepreneurs have to be open. They have to understand that they are in a market that is very competitive, a market that a lot of opportunity exists, and you're in a market that it's a go-getting market. You have to go out and you have to drive along what you want. You have to be able to understand your enterprise, how it maps into the industry that you are in, and what you can do to always keep ahead of the curve. Because we're not in a slow environment anymore. We're in a market, and I like to say this quite often. Historically, when we spoke about an international market, we were speaking about a market that existed outside of the Guyanese borders. Now the international market is outside your door. You wake up every morning and you step outside your door, you are in the internationally competitive market. So many eyes are on Guyana, so many trade missions come into Guyana, so many enterprises are interested in Guyana. And so no one is coming to save you. No one is coming to be your proverbial godfather and help you out of any jam that you're in. You have to be cognizant, have the foresight, keep up to date, stay educated, be on top of trends in your industry, and ensure that you continue to innovate. That is really my advice in a nutshell for Guyanese enterprises. Obviously, it can be much more long-winded. And then for the labor market, for the Guyanese workers, it's at its core, it's the same. You are now in an environment where you ought not to take things for granted. Stay on top of your profession. Continue to update your skill sets. Utilize the training opportunities that are there. Conduct oneself in a professional manner. And make a good impression in every single facet that you touch. And I think a single important piece of advice as well is to be reliable. Enterprises as well as professionals or Guyanese workers, we've had this Caribbean-esque type of culture where, oh man, it's my cousin's son birthday today, and I can't come. I can't come tomorrow because something happened with my toe, so I didn't feel like coming out of bed. We have to come out of that mindset and understand that where we are headed to, where we are already at, and where we're heading to in the future as a competitive market, embracing all of the investments that are happening, living the reality of exponential rates of growth. There's no space for slackness. So that would be my advice. It's essentially the same for both, but within their different realms.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard, for that advice and for being a part of Ignite Insights. This was a very refreshing conversation. I hope it felt so for you too.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts.
That's it for this edition of Ignite Insights. Stay tuned for more engaging conversations with the change makers shaping our nation. I'm Ramona Luthi. See you next time.